They fired me because I supposedly made the clients uncomfortable by limping to the conference room. That's what Richard Brennan, senior partner at Hartwell and Associates, wrote in my termination letter. 23 words that reduced 4 years of exemplary service, 2 Purple Hearts, and a Bronze Star to nothing more than an inconvenience. But the real reason had nothing to do with my prosthetic leg, and everything to do with the fact that I knew too much about what was really happening behind those mahogany doors. I'd just finished a grueling 18-hour marathon session preparing for the Morrison Industries acquisition, the kind of deal that would either make or break our mid-sized consulting firm. My team and I had been working around the clock for 6 weeks, analyzing every regulatory compliance issue, every potential liability, every possible obstacle that could derail the $180 million merger. The client presentation was scheduled for 9 a.m. sharp, and by 3 a.m. that morning, I was still in the office, triple checking the final compliance reports that would determine whether Morrison Industries would trust us with their future. My prosthetic had been acting up for days. The socket wasn't fitting right, probably from the stress and the long hours, but I'd powered through it like I always did. You don't survive 2 tours in Afghanistan and multiple IED explosions by giving up when things get uncomfortable. You adapt, you overcome, you complete the mission. That's what I'd been doing for 4 years at Hartwell and Associates, and it's what I was doing that morning when I hobbled into conference room A at 8:45 a.m., 15 minutes before the most important client meeting of the quarter. The Morrison Industries executives were already seated around the polished oak table, their expensive suits and confident demeanor filling the room with the kind of energy that comes from controlling 9-figure budgets. I'd prepared for this moment for weeks, memorizing every detail of their corporate structure, their regulatory history, their compliance challenges. These weren't just potential clients to me, they were a puzzle I'd already solved. Richard Brennan swept into the room at exactly 9 a.m., his silver hair perfectly styled, his Armani suit pressed to perfection. He was the kind of man who believed his presence alone could close deals, the kind who thought charm and golf handicaps mattered more than actual expertise. He shook hands with each Morrison executive, his laugh booming across the room as he settled into his chair at the head of the table. That's when he noticed me, and I was arranging my files at the side table. My prosthetic leg extended slightly as I balanced myself while reaching for the compliance binders. It was a perfectly normal movement, the kind of minor adjustment I'd made thousands of times over the past 3 years since losing my leg to an IED outside Kandahar. But Richard's eyes narrowed, and I saw something flicker across his face that I'd seen before in civilian life. Disgust, embarrassment, the look of someone who wished I would just disappear. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying that false cheerfulness that barely concealed his irritation. "Why don't you wait outside? I think we can handle the presentation from here." I straightened up, my hands still resting on the compliance files I'd spent weeks preparing. "Mr. Brennan, I need to be here for the regulatory discussion. The Morrison team specifically requested—" I said, "Wait outside." His voice was sharper now, cutting through the polite murmur of conversation. The Morrison executives had gone quiet, their attention suddenly focused on the tension crackling between us. But I didn't move. I couldn't. This was my work, my expertise, my moment to prove that 4 years of dedication meant something. "Sir, with respect, these are my files. I prepared this entire compliance analysis the clients need to hear directly from Miss Torres." His voice dropped to a whisper, but somehow it carried more venom than if he'd shouted. "Your condition is making our clients uncomfortable. Look at yourself. Look at how you're standing. This is a professional environment, not a charity case." The room went dead silent. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to pause. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, not from shame, but from a rage so pure it took every ounce of my military training to keep from responding. The Morrison executives shifted in their chairs, their faces carefully neutral, but I could see the discomfort in their eyes. Not discomfort with my disability, discomfort with what they'd just witnessed. "Are you suggesting," I said, my voice steady despite the fury building in my chest, "that my prosthetic leg somehow compromises my ability to discuss regulatory compliance?" Richard's face flushed. He'd gone too far and he knew it, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. I'm suggesting that you're not presenting the professional image this firm requires. Now, please, step outside so we can continue with business. I looked around the table at the Morrison executives. Their CEO, Patricia Morrison, was staring at Richard with barely concealed disgust. Their general counsel, an older woman with steel gray hair, was taking notes on her tablet, her expression unreadable. Their CFO was studying his hands, clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation. I see, I said quietly. I gathered my files, my movements deliberate and precise. I'll be in my office if anyone needs to discuss the actual substance of these compliance issues. As I walked toward the door, my prosthetic clicking softly against the polished floor, I heard Richard's voice behind me, artificially bright and cheerful as he tried to reset the mood. Now then, shall we discuss the Morrison Industries acquisition? I think you'll find our team has prepared a comprehensive analysis. But I was already gone, walking down the hallway toward my office, my mind racing. Not with hurt, not with self-pity, but with calculation. Because Richard Brennan had just made the biggest mistake of his professional life, and he had no idea what he'd set in motion. I'd been documenting everything for months. Every inappropriate comment, every time I'd been passed over for assignments despite my qualifications, every instance where my military experience and legal expertise had been dismissed or ignored. I'd been building a case without even realizing it, creating a paper trail that would soon become Richard Brennan's professional death sentence. The termination letter would arrive 3 hours later, but by then, I was already making phone calls that would change everything. 3 hours before Richard Brennan destroyed his career, I was sitting in my office at 6 a.m., reviewing the final compliance audit for the Morrison Industries deal. While the rest of the firm slept comfortably in their suburban homes, I was already on my third cup of coffee, cross-referencing federal regulations with state requirements, making sure every detail was perfect. This wasn't unusual for me. I'd been the first one in the office and the last one out for 4 years running, ever since Hartwell and Associates took a chance on a disabled veteran with a law degree and a determination to prove herself. My military service record spoke for itself, but civilians rarely understood what it meant. 2 tours in Afghanistan, both as a military intelligence officer specializing in logistics and operational security. I'd coordinated supply chains across hostile territory, managed multi-million-dollar equipment inventories, and briefed generals on strategic vulnerabilities. When an IED took my left leg below the knee during my second deployment, I spent 8 months in recovery, earned my law degree through online courses while learning to walk again, and graduated summa cum laude with a concentration in corporate compliance and regulatory law. The transition from military to civilian life wasn't easy, but I'd found my niche at Hartwell and Associates. Corporate compliance was like military intelligence work in expensive suits. You analyzed threats, identified vulnerabilities, and developed strategies to protect your assets. The only difference was the enemy wore $1,000 suits instead of tactical gear, and they attacked with lawsuits instead of explosives. My track record was flawless. In 4 years, I'd handled 73 major compliance reviews, saved the firm from 16 potential regulatory violations, and personally recovered over $2.3 million in avoided penalties and fines. The pharmaceutical company audit I'd completed 6 months earlier had prevented a disaster that would have cost them their FDA approval and billions in potential lawsuits. The energy sector compliance review I'd led had identified environmental violations that were corrected before federal inspectors arrived, saving our client from criminal charges. But my specialty was merger and acquisition compliance, the complex web of regulations that could make or break multi-million-dollar deals. I'd developed a proprietary checklist system that covered every federal agency, every state requirement, every potential regulatory pitfall that could derail a transaction. Other firms had tried to poach me 3 times in the past year, offering significant salary increases and partnership tracks. I'd turned them all down out of loyalty to Hartwell and Associates, believing that dedication and results would eventually be rewarded. The Morrison Industries acquisition was supposed to be my masterpiece. Morrison was a mid-sized manufacturing company with operations in 12 states, each with different regulatory requirements. They'd been cited for minor violations in 3 states over the past 5 years, nothing serious, but enough to create red flags for potential buyers. The acquiring company, Meridian Holdings, had hired us specifically because of my reputation for identifying and resolving compliance issues before they became deal breakers. I'd spent 6 weeks diving deep into Morrison's operations, traveling to their facilities in Ohio, Texas, and North Carolina. I'd interviewed their plant managers, reviewed their safety protocols, analyzed their environmental compliance records, and identified 17 potential issues that could derail the acquisition. More importantly, I developed solutions for all 17 problems, complete with implementation timelines and cost estimates. The work had been exhausting. My prosthetic wasn't designed for the constant travel and long hours, but I'd pushed through the discomfort because the job demanded it. I'd worked through weekends, sacrificed my social life, and even canceled a vacation to visit my sister in Colorado. My apartment had become a secondary office, with Morrison Industries documents covering every surface, regulatory manuals stacked on my kitchen table, and my laptop running compliance calculations until the early hours of the morning. The breakthrough came at 2 a.m. on a Thursday night, 3 weeks before the client presentation. I was reviewing Morrison's Ohio facility records when I noticed a discrepancy in their environmental monitoring reports. The numbers didn't match EPA requirements, but they weren't obviously wrong either. It took me 12 hours of cross-referencing federal regulations, state requirements, and industry standards to realize that Morrison had been using an outdated calculation method that would likely trigger a federal investigation within the next 6 months. I'd called Morrison's environmental compliance officer at 6 a.m. Friday morning, explaining the issue and walking him through the correction process. By Monday, they'd implemented new monitoring procedures that brought them into full compliance. The acquiring company never even knew how close they'd come to inheriting a multi-million-dollar environmental liability. That was typical of my work at Hartwell and Associates. I solved problems before they became crises, prevented disasters before they happened, and saved clients money they never knew they were about to lose. My military training had taught me to think 3 moves ahead, to anticipate problems before they materialized, to protect the mission at all costs. But despite my track record, I was still being paid $20,000 less than my male colleagues with similar experience. I was still excluded from the Friday afternoon strategy meetings where partnership decisions were made. I was still introduced to clients as our compliance specialist rather than our senior compliance officer, even though I'd been handling senior level work for 2 years. The Morrison Industries presentation was supposed to change that. Richard Brennan had promised me a promotion and a $30,000 salary increase if I could close the deal. He'd said the partnership was considering me for senior associate, that my military background and legal expertise made me valuable to the firm's future. I'd believed him because I wanted to believe that 4 years of exceptional work would finally be recognized. Instead, I was sitting in my office, staring at a termination letter that reduced my career to a single sentence about making clients uncomfortable. The letter was dated today, signed by Richard Brennan himself, effective immediately. No severance package, no opportunity to explain, no acknowledgement of my contributions to the firm. But what Richard didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this moment longer than either of us realized. What Richard Brennan didn't know was that for the past 8 months, I'd been working with Caldwell and Associates, one of the most prestigious civil rights law firms in the country. Not as a client, but as a consultant. While he thought I was just another employee processing compliance reports, I was actually helping them build discrimination cases against major corporations, using my unique combination of military intelligence training and legal expertise to identify patterns of systemic bias that other lawyers missed. It started as a side project, something to keep my legal skills sharp while working in corporate compliance. Jennifer Caldwell, the firm's founding partner, had reached out to me through a veterans advocacy group, asking if I'd be interested in reviewing discrimination cases from a military perspective. She'd heard about my work exposing fraud in defense contracts during my time in Afghanistan, and she thought my analytical skills might translate well to civil rights law. The first case she sent me was a wrongful termination lawsuit against a tech company that had fired a disabled veteran for supposedly not fitting the company culture. The employee had been dismissed after requesting reasonable accommodations for his PTSD, and the company claimed his condition made other employees uncomfortable. Within 24 hours, I'd identified 17 different pieces of evidence that proved discriminatory intent, including email threads, performance reviews, and meeting notes that the company's own lawyers had overlooked. Jennifer was impressed. "You see patterns that other people miss," she told me during our first video call. "You understand how discrimination works in corporate environments because you've lived it." She offered me a consulting contract, paying me $200 per hour to review discrimination cases and provide strategic analysis. The work was fascinating, completely different from corporate compliance, but requiring the same attention to detail, the same ability to spot inconsistencies and connect seemingly unrelated pieces of information. I was essentially doing intelligence work again, but instead of protecting military assets, I was protecting people's civil rights. The irony wasn't lost on me. While I was helping other companies avoid discrimination lawsuits during my day job at Hartwell and Associates, I was spending my evenings and weekends helping people fight discrimination lawsuits against companies just like Hartwell. Jennifer had a strict confidentiality agreement, and I was careful to avoid any conflicts of interest. But the work gave me a unique perspective on how discrimination actually functioned in corporate America. Over 8 months, I'd consulted on 43 cases, helping secure settlements totaling over $12 million for victims of workplace discrimination. I'd learned to recognize the subtle signs of bias that most people missed, the carefully coded language in performance reviews, the patterns in promotion decisions, the way certain employees were excluded from informal networks and decision-making processes. I developed a systematic approach to documenting discrimination, creating paper trails that could withstand legal scrutiny. But the most important thing I'd learned was how to build an airtight case. Jennifer had taught me that discrimination lawsuits weren't won on emotion or moral outrage. They were won on documentation, patterns, and evidence. The best discrimination cases, she'd explained, are the ones where the defendants convict themselves with their own words and actions. That's exactly what had been happening at Hartwell and Associates, though I didn't fully realize it until 3 months ago. I'd been documenting Richard's behavior instinctively, keeping detailed records of every inappropriate comment, every time I'd been passed over for promotion, every instance where my military experience had been dismissed or mocked. I'd been doing it partly for my own protection, partly out of habit from my intelligence work, but mostly because something felt wrong about the way I was being treated. The pattern became clear when I started applying the same analytical framework I used for Jennifer's cases to my own situation. Richard's behavior wasn't random or personal. It was systematic discrimination, carefully disguised as legitimate business decisions. He'd been undermining me for years, taking credit for my work while simultaneously portraying me as a liability to the firm. 3 weeks ago, I'd called Jennifer and asked her to review my situation. I'd sent her 4 years of performance reviews, email threads, meeting notes, and documented incidents, along with my detailed analysis of the patterns I'd identified. She'd called me back within 6 hours. "Sarah, this is one of the clearest cases of disability discrimination I've ever seen," she'd said. "And the best part is, you've documented everything perfectly. You've essentially built the entire case for us." She'd offered to represent me immediately, but I'd asked her to wait. I wanted to give Richard one more chance to do the right thing, to prove that maybe I was wrong about his intentions. The Morrison Industries presentation was supposed to be my test case, my opportunity to demonstrate my value to the firm one final time. Instead, Richard had provided the perfect capstone to 4 years of discrimination. His comments in the conference room weren't just inappropriate. They were exactly the kind of explicit bias that discrimination lawyers dream of capturing on record. And thanks to my military training and intelligence background, I'd been prepared. What Richard didn't know was that I'd been recording every interaction with him for the past 3 months, following Jennifer's advice about gathering evidence. The small digital recorder in my jacket pocket had captured every word of his humiliating tirade, including his specific comments about my condition and his demand that I leave because my prosthetic leg made clients uncomfortable. He also didn't know that 2 of the Morrison Industries executives were military veterans themselves, and that Patricia Morrison's husband was a retired Army colonel who'd lost his arm in Iraq. The disgusted looks on their faces during Richard's outburst weren't just professional embarrassment. They were personal revulsion at watching a disabled veteran being humiliated by her own employer. But most importantly, Richard didn't know that Jennifer Caldwell was already preparing a discrimination lawsuit that would destroy not just his career, but his entire firm's reputation. The termination letter he just delivered was the final piece of evidence she needed to prove systematic discrimination. The phone was already ringing as I sat in my office, staring at the termination letter that would soon become Exhibit A in a federal discrimination lawsuit. The call that changed everything came 8 months earlier on a rainy Tuesday evening when I was working late again, reviewing environmental compliance reports for a chemical manufacturing client. I'd been at Hartwell and Associates for 3.5 years by then, and the pattern was already well established. I'd work twice as hard as anyone else, produce exceptional results, and watch as credit for my work somehow migrated to Richard Brennan's corner office. My phone rang at 9:47 p.m. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was local. I almost let it go to voicemail, assuming it was another telemarketer, but something made me answer. Sarah Torres? This is Jennifer Caldwell from Caldwell and Associates. I hope I'm not calling too late. I knew the name immediately. Jennifer Caldwell was a legend in civil rights law, a former federal prosecutor who'd founded her own firm specializing in discrimination cases. She'd won landmark settlements against Fortune 500 companies, argued cases before the Supreme Court, and been featured on the cover of American Lawyer magazine 3 times. The fact that she was calling me personally at nearly 10 o'clock at night was surreal. Ms. Caldwell, this is an honor. What can I do for you? I got your name from Maria Santos at the Veterans Legal Aid Society. She said you might be able to help me with a case I'm working on. Do you have a few minutes to talk? I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair. Of course. What kind of case? Wrongful termination. The client is a disabled veteran who was fired from a defense contractor for supposedly compromising workplace safety. The company claims his prosthetic arm made other employees nervous that he couldn't perform his duties adequately. But I think there's more to it. Something in her voice told me this wasn't a routine consultation. What makes you think that? Because the employee in question was actually their best engineer. He'd designed 3 different systems that saved the company millions of dollars in production costs. His performance reviews were exceptional until the day he requested a simple accommodation for his prosthetic. Then suddenly, he became a liability. I felt a familiar knot forming in my stomach. What kind of accommodation? He asked for a slightly modified workstation, nothing expensive or disruptive, just a different desk height and some specialized tools. The request was denied, and 2 weeks later, he was terminated for safety concerns. The parallels to my own situation were impossible to ignore. I'd been requesting minor accommodations for my prosthetic leg for years, things like a different chair or permission to stand during long meetings. Most of my requests were approved, but always with a subtle suggestion that I was being difficult, that I was asking for special treatment. What do you need from me? Maria mentioned that you have a military intelligence background, that you're good at spotting patterns and inconsistencies. I've been doing civil rights law for 20 years, but I don't always understand the military perspective. I was hoping you could review the case file and tell me what I'm missing. I'd never consulted on a legal case before, but the challenge intrigued me. I'd be happy to take a look. When do you need this? How about now? I'm in my office, and I could email you the files tonight. This case goes to mediation next week, and I want to make sure I'm not missing anything. It's almost 10 o'clock. Jennifer laughed. Welcome to civil rights law. The other side has unlimited resources and armies of lawyers. We stay competitive by working harder and being smarter. She sent me the files at 10:15 p.m. By midnight, I'd read through every document, every email, every performance review. By 2 a.m., I'd created a detailed timeline of events, cross-referenced with the company's own HR policies and accommodation procedures. By 4 a.m., I'd identified 17 separate instances where the company had violated federal disability laws, plus 3 smoking gun emails that proved discriminatory intent. I called Jennifer at 6 a.m. You found something, she said, answering on the first ring. I found everything. This company didn't just discriminate against your client, they documented their discrimination in writing. They have an entire email thread discussing how to get rid of him without triggering a lawsuit. Show me. I spent the next hour walking her through my analysis, explaining how the company had systematically undermined their employee while creating a paper trail that made their discrimination look like legitimate business decisions. But they'd made mistakes, small inconsistencies that revealed their true motivations. The key is in the timing, I explained. Look at the dates. His accommodation request was submitted on March 15th. The first safety concern was documented on March 22nd, exactly 1 week later. Before that, he'd worked there for 3 years without a single safety incident. And the performance reviews? They show a clear pattern of retaliation. His ratings dropped dramatically after he requested accommodations, but his actual work product remained excellent. They were punishing him for being disabled, not for poor performance. Jennifer was quiet for a long moment. Sarah, this is exceptional work. You've identified patterns that I completely missed. Would you be interested in consulting on more cases like this? The offer was tempting, but I hesitated. I work full-time at a corporate law firm. I'm not sure I have the time. I'm not talking about a full-time commitment. Maybe 10 hours a week, reviewing cases and providing strategic analysis. I'd pay you $200 per hour, and you'd be helping people who really need it. $200 an hour was more than I made at Hartwell and Associates, even with my salary. But the money wasn't what convinced me. It was the opportunity to use my skills for something meaningful, to help people who were facing the same discrimination I dealt with every day. I'll do it, I said, but I need complete confidentiality. My current employer can't know about this. Of course, attorney-client privilege extends to our consultants. Your identity will be protected. That's how I became Jennifer Caldwell's secret weapon, spending my evenings and weekends helping her build cases against companies that discriminated against disabled employees. I had no idea that 8 months later I'd be building a case against my own employer. The degradation started so subtly that I almost missed it myself. It began 2 weeks after I'd started consulting for Jennifer Caldwell when Richard Brennan called me into his office for what he described as a performance improvement discussion. I'd just successfully completed the Patterson Industries compliance review, identifying and resolving 12 potential regulatory violations that could have cost them their FDA approval. The client had specifically requested that I lead their next quarterly review, but Richard seemed annoyed rather than pleased. Sarah, we need to talk about your professional presentation, he said, gesturing for me to sit in the chair across from his desk. His office was designed to intimidate, with dark wood paneling, leather-bound legal volumes, and a massive mahogany desk that created a physical barrier between him and visitors. I've been getting some feedback about your interactions with clients. I set down my coffee cup and looked at him directly. What kind of feedback? Well, there's the matter of your mobility issues. I know you can't help it, but some clients have mentioned that you seem uncomfortable during meetings. The way you adjust your position, the way you sometimes need to stand or stretch. It's distracting. The comment hit me like a physical blow, but I kept my expression neutral. Mr. Brennan, I've never had a client complain about my work product. The Patterson Industries team specifically requested that I— This isn't about your work product, he interrupted. It's about client comfort. We're in a service industry, Sarah. Perception matters as much as performance. Over the following months, the criticism became more frequent and more personal. Richard would call me into his office every few weeks, always with some new concern about my professional image. He questioned my choice to wear flats instead of heels, saying it made me look too casual for client meetings. He suggested I should sit at the back of conference rooms instead of at the main table, claiming it would be less disruptive if I needed to make adjustments to my prosthetic during long meetings. The most humiliating incident came during the quarterly partners meeting in September. I'd been invited to present my analysis of new federal regulations that would affect 3 of our major clients. I'd spent weeks preparing the presentation, creating detailed charts and implementation timelines that would save our clients millions in potential penalties. But when I stood up to begin my presentation, Richard interrupted before I could speak. Before we start, I want to address something with the group, he said, his voice carrying that false concern that had become his trademark. Sarah, I know you've been dealing with some physical challenges lately. Are you sure you're up for standing through a full presentation? We could always have you participate from your seat. Every eye in the room was suddenly focused on my prosthetic leg. I felt heat rising in my cheeks, but I forced myself to remain professional. I'm perfectly capable of giving my presentation as planned, Mr. Brennan. Of course, of course. I just don't want you to overexert yourself. We all understand that you have to work within certain limitations. He'd done it again, made my disability the focal point of a professional meeting while appearing to be considerate and supportive. The other partners nodded along, probably thinking he was being compassionate, but I could see the calculation in his eyes. He was systematically undermining my credibility, making my colleagues see me as fragile and limited rather than competent and valuable. The pattern extended to client interactions as well. Richard began excluding me from initial client meetings, claiming he wanted to set the right tone before bringing in the technical team. When I did participate in client presentations, he would interrupt my explanations to provide clarification, often repeating exactly what I'd just said in different words. He'd introduce me as our very dedicated compliance specialist, rather than using my actual title, making me sound like an entry-level employee rather than someone with 4 years of experience and a specialty in regulatory law. The worst part was watching him take credit for my work. The Morrison Industries analysis that I'd spent 6 weeks developing became a comprehensive review that Richard Brennan personally oversaw. The Patterson Industries compliance success became another example of Richard's strategic thinking and attention to detail. My innovations in regulatory analysis were reframed as implementations of Richard's forward-thinking approach to client service. But I endured it all, documenting every incident, every inappropriate comment, every time I was diminished or dismissed. My military training had taught me patience and strategic thinking. I knew that responding emotionally would only confirm Richard's narrative that I was unprofessional and difficult to work with. Instead, I focused on doing exceptional work, building relationships with clients, and quietly building my case. The breaking point came during the Henderson manufacturing review in February. I'd identified a critical environmental compliance issue that could have resulted in criminal charges against the company's executives. The solution required immediate action and careful coordination with federal regulators. I'd worked for 72 hours straight, barely sleeping, to develop a remediation plan that would keep Henderson out of federal court. When I presented my findings to Richard, he seemed genuinely impressed. "This is excellent work, Sarah. Really exceptional. I'll present this to the Henderson board myself and make sure they understand the urgency." But when Richard met with the Henderson executives, he presented my work as his own discovery, his own analysis, his own solution. I watched from the conference room doorway as he explained the compliance issues I'd identified, using my exact words, my precise recommendations, my detailed implementation timeline. The Henderson CEO shook Richard's hand and thanked him for saving the company from a federal investigation. Later that day, Richard called me into his office again. "Sarah, I wanted to thank you for your support on the Henderson matter. Your assistance was very valuable." Assistance. 4 years of building expertise, 3 days of intensive analysis, and a solution that saved a client from criminal prosecution. And I was reduced to providing assistance to Richard Brennan's genius. That night, I called Jennifer Caldwell and told her I was ready to document my own case. The revelation came to me gradually, like morning light creeping through Venetian blinds. I'd been so focused on proving myself, on earning Richard's respect and recognition, that I'd missed the obvious truth staring me in the face. Richard Brennan wasn't just taking credit for my work, he was completely dependent on it. Without my expertise, my analysis, my strategic thinking, he was nothing more than an expensive suit with a corner office. The realization hit me fully during the Westfield energy crisis in March. Westfield had been hit with a surprise EPA investigation, the kind that could shut down their operations within days if not handled properly. The company's executives were panicking, facing potential criminal charges and millions in fines. They'd called Hartwell and Associates at 6 a.m. on a Monday morning, demanding immediate action. Richard took the call, his voice confident and reassuring as he promised Westfield's CEO that everything would be handled. Don't worry, Jim. We've dealt with situations like this before. I'll personally oversee the response and have a comprehensive strategy to you by end of business today. After hanging up, Richard immediately called me into his office. His confident demeanor had evaporated, replaced by barely controlled panic. Sarah, I need you to handle this Westfield situation. They're facing federal charges, and I have no idea what we're dealing with. I spent the next 12 hours diving deep into Westfield's regulatory history, analyzing EPA documents, and coordinating with environmental lawyers across 3 states. By 8 p.m., I'd developed a comprehensive response strategy that would minimize Westfield's exposure and potentially avoid criminal charges entirely. The plan required immediate implementation, precise timing, and careful coordination with federal regulators. Richard reviewed my work for 10 minutes, nodding along as I explained the complexities of environmental law and the specific regulatory requirements we needed to address. It was clear he understood maybe half of what I was telling him, but he took detailed notes and asked me to prepare a client presentation. The next morning, I watched Richard present my strategy to Westfield's board of directors. He stood confidently at the head of the conference table, using my PowerPoint slides, repeating my analysis word for word, explaining regulatory nuances he'd learned from me just 12 hours earlier. When the CEO asked a technical question about EPA enforcement procedures, Richard paused for a moment, then gave the exact answer I'd provided during our preparation session. Excellent work, Richard, the CEO said as the meeting concluded. I don't know what we would have done without your expertise. After the client left, Richard pulled me aside. Good supporting work on this one, Sarah. I appreciate you putting together those background materials for me. Background materials. I'd created the entire strategy, solved a crisis that could have destroyed a company, and prevented federal criminal charges. But in Richard's mind, I'd simply provided background materials to support his brilliant leadership. That's when I began to see the pattern clearly. Richard wasn't just stealing credit for my work. He was completely incompetent without it. His reputation, his client relationships, his entire career was built on the foundation of my expertise. He was like a skilled actor performing a role I'd written for him, but if I ever stopped providing the script, his performance would collapse immediately. I started testing this theory, making small changes to see how Richard would react. During client calls, I'd deliberately withhold certain details, watching as Richard floundered when asked questions he couldn't answer. I'd provide him with incomplete analyses, seeing how he'd try to fill in gaps in his knowledge with vague generalities and corporate buzzwords. The results were revealing. Without my detailed preparation, Richard was exposed as someone who understood legal jargon, but had no real grasp of regulatory compliance. He could recite the names of federal agencies and throw around impressive-sounding terminology, but he couldn't explain how different regulations interacted or identify potential compliance risks. His expertise was entirely superficial, memorized rather than understood. The irony wasn't lost on me. During my military service, I'd specialized in identifying and exploiting enemy weaknesses, finding the vulnerabilities that could bring down entire operational networks. Now I was applying those same analytical skills to my own situation, and what I discovered was both infuriating and empowering. Richard Brennan was completely vulnerable. His entire professional identity was built on a foundation of borrowed expertise. If that foundation were ever removed, if clients ever discovered that their trusted advisor was actually dependent on a disabled veteran he'd been systematically undermining, his career would collapse instantly. I began to understand that my position at Hartwell and Associates wasn't nearly as precarious as Richard wanted me to believe. I wasn't a replaceable employee who should be grateful for the opportunity to work at a prestigious firm. I was the engine that powered Richard's success, the expertise that made his reputation possible. Without me, he was nothing. But the most important realization was that I had choices. I could continue enabling Richard's charade, allowing him to build his career on my work while treating me as a liability, or I could take control of my own narrative, demonstrate my true value, and force the firm to recognize what I actually brought to the table. The question wasn't whether I was good enough to succeed at Hartwell and Associates. The question was whether Hartwell and Associates was good enough to deserve my continued loyalty. The moment that almost changed everything happened on a Thursday afternoon in late March, 3 weeks before the Morrison Industries presentation. I'd been working late again, reviewing environmental compliance reports in my office, when I heard something unusual coming from Richard's office down the hall. It wasn't the confident voice I was used to hearing during client calls or the commanding tone he used in staff meetings. It was quieter, strained, almost broken. I walked closer to investigate, not to eavesdrop, but because I was genuinely concerned. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see Richard sitting at his desk, his head in his hands, phone pressed to his ear. His usually perfect posture was slumped, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his silver hair was disheveled as if he'd been running his fingers through it repeatedly. "I know, Mom, I know," he was saying, his voice thick with exhaustion. "The doctors said it could be another 6 months before we know anything definitive. Maybe longer." I froze in the hallway, realizing I was intruding on a deeply private conversation. I should have walked away, returned to my office, and pretended I hadn't heard anything. But something in his voice stopped me. It was the sound of someone carrying a weight too heavy to bear alone. "The treatments are expensive," he continued, his voice cracking slightly. "Insurance covers some of it, but not enough. I'm trying to find specialists, but the good ones don't take our plan. I need this promotion, Mom. I need the partnership. It's the only way I can afford to get you the care you need." My chest tightened. I'd had no idea Richard was dealing with a family medical crisis. In 4 years of working together, he'd never mentioned personal struggles, never asked for flexibility or understanding. He'd always projected an image of complete control, of someone whose life was as perfectly managed as his professional reputation. "I can't lose this job," he whispered into the phone. "If they find out how much I've been struggling, if they realize I'm not as sharp as I used to be, they'll find someone younger, someone hungrier. I'm 62, Mom. I can't start over again." I backed away from the door, quietly, my mind racing. Suddenly, Richard's behavior over the past few months made more sense. The increased scrutiny of my work, the way he'd been micromanaging every client interaction, the desperate way he'd been taking credit for my successes. He wasn't just being an arrogant boss, he was scared. But the revelation that stayed with me wasn't about his mother's illness or his financial struggles. It was the fear in his voice when he said, "If they realize I'm not as sharp as I used to be." Richard knew he was losing his edge, knew that his expertise was slipping away, and he was using my work to cover for his own declining abilities. That night, I sat in my apartment, staring at the wall, trying to process what I'd heard. Part of me felt genuine sympathy for Richard. Caring for a sick parent while trying to maintain a demanding career was overwhelming for anyone. The pressure to appear strong and competent while your personal life was falling apart was something I understood intimately. I'd gone through my own version of that struggle during my recovery from my injuries, maintaining a facade of progress while battling depression and chronic pain. For the first time in months, I saw Richard, not as a villain, but as a human being carrying burdens I couldn't fully understand. His mother was dying, his career was threatened, and he was drowning in responsibilities he couldn't manage alone. Maybe his treatment of me wasn't malicious. Maybe it was just desperation. I found myself making excuses for his behavior. The way he'd been taking credit for my work could be seen as strategic delegation, rather than theft. The comments about my disability could be interpreted as misguided attempts to protect me from client prejudice rather than discrimination. The systematic undermining of my credibility could be viewed as a senior partner's attempt to maintain authority in a crisis rather than deliberate sabotage. For 3 days, I wrestled with these rationalizations. I considered approaching Richard directly, offering to help with his workload, suggesting we work together more collaboratively. I even drafted an email offering to take on additional responsibilities if he needed flexibility for personal matters. Maybe we could find a way to work together that honored both our needs. But then Friday afternoon arrived, and with it, the Henderson Manufacturing Celebration lunch. Henderson's CEO had called that morning to thank the firm for our exceptional work on their environmental compliance crisis. He'd specifically mentioned Richard's brilliant strategic thinking and deep understanding of regulatory law. A $50,000 bonus check was being delivered to recognize our outstanding service, and Richard had suggested we celebrate with lunch at the Four Seasons. I arrived at the restaurant expecting a team celebration, a moment to acknowledge the collaborative effort that had saved Henderson from federal prosecution. Instead, I found Richard holding court at a table full of the firm's senior partners, regaling them with stories of his innovative approach to environmental law. The key insight, Richard was saying, gesturing with his wine glass, was recognizing that the EPA's enforcement priorities had shifted. Most lawyers would have focused on the obvious violations, but I saw the bigger picture. I understood that we needed to address the systemic issues, not just the surface problems. He was describing my analysis, my insights, my strategic thinking, but presenting it as his own revelation. Every innovative solution I developed was reframed as Richard's expertise. Every complex regulatory interpretation I'd provided was attributed to his years of experience in environmental law. The worst part was watching the other partners' reactions. They were genuinely impressed by Richard's supposed brilliance, asking follow-up questions about his methodology, requesting his insights on other environmental matters. Richard answered confidently, using terminology I'd taught him, explaining concepts he'd learned from my memos, building his reputation on the foundation of my expertise. When the Henderson CEO arrived to personally thank Richard for saving the company, I watched Richard accept the praise with gracious humility. "It's what we do," he said, shaking the CEO's hand. "I'm just glad we could help." Not we. Richard's choice of pronoun was deliberate, claiming sole credit for work that had consumed 3 weeks of my life. And that's when I understood that Richard's personal struggles, however genuine, didn't excuse his professional behavior. His mother's illness didn't justify stealing credit for my work. His financial pressures didn't excuse his systematic undermining of my credibility. His fear of losing his position didn't make it acceptable for him to build his security on the foundation of my exploitation. I might have felt sorry for Richard the man, but I could no longer tolerate Richard the boss. Desperation might explain his actions, but it didn't justify them. And more importantly, his willingness to sacrifice my career for his own security proved that he saw me not as a colleague or even as a person, but as a resource to be used and discarded as needed. The sympathy I'd felt for him evaporated, replaced by a cold clarity. Richard wasn't just taking credit for my work. He was erasing my contributions while building his future on my expertise. He was willing to destroy my career to save his own, and he was doing it with the same calculating precision he brought to client negotiations. That night, I called Jennifer Caldwell and told her I was ready to move forward with my case. The crisis arrived exactly as I'd predicted it would during the Morrison Industries preliminary review meeting on the Monday before our scheduled presentation. Richard had insisted on handling the initial client discussion himself, claiming he wanted to set the proper tone before bringing in the technical team. I'd prepared a comprehensive briefing document for him, outlining every key point, every potential concern, every regulatory nuance that Morrison's executives might raise. But I'd also made a strategic decision. Instead of my usual exhaustive preparation, I'd provided Richard with just enough information to get started, holding back the critical details that would matter most when the discussion got complex. I wanted to see what would happen when Richard had to think on his feet, when he couldn't rely on my invisible safety net. The Morrison Industries delegation arrived at 10 a.m. sharp, led by Patricia Morrison herself, along with their general counsel, Lisa Chen, and their head of operations, David Rodriguez. These weren't junior executives who could be impressed by confident generalities. They were seasoned professionals who'd built a $200 million company from the ground up. They knew their business inside and out, and they expected their advisors to demonstrate the same level of expertise. Richard opened the meeting with his usual charm offensive, his voice booming with confidence as he welcomed the Morrison team to our offices. "Patricia, Lisa, David, welcome to Hartwell and Associates. I'm excited to discuss how we can facilitate this acquisition and ensure a smooth transition for Morrison Industries." Patricia Morrison smiled politely, but I could see the calculation in her eyes. She'd built her company by reading people accurately, by identifying who could deliver results and who was just talking. Thank you, Richard. We're looking forward to understanding your approach to regulatory compliance. This acquisition involves operations in 12 states, each with different requirements. We need to know that you understand the complexity of what we're dealing with. Richard nodded confidently. Absolutely. Regulatory compliance is the foundation of any successful acquisition. At Hartwell and Associates, we take a comprehensive approach to identifying and addressing potential issues before they become problems. It was a perfect opening response, the kind of confident generality that could apply to any situation. But Lisa Chen, the general counsel, immediately pressed for specifics. Can you walk us through your process for handling environmental compliance issues? Morrison has manufacturing facilities in Ohio, Texas, and North Carolina, and we've had some minor citations over the past few years. How would you address those in the context of the acquisition? Richard's smile faltered slightly. I'd covered this exact scenario in my briefing document, but I'd intentionally kept the details vague. Well, environmental compliance is certainly a critical component of any manufacturing acquisition. We'd need to conduct a thorough review of your facilities and ensure all regulatory requirements are met. David Rodriguez leaned forward. What specific regulations are you referring to? We're dealing with different EPA regions, different state environmental agencies, and different local requirements. Which ones pose the greatest risk to the acquisition timeline? The question hung in the air like smoke. Richard's eyes darted to his notes, then back to the Morrison team. That's exactly the kind of detailed analysis we'd conduct as part of our comprehensive review process. EPA regulations, state requirements, local compliance issues. We'd examine all of those factors. But he wasn't answering the question. He was deflecting, using generic terms that revealed his lack of specific knowledge. Patricia Morrison's expression remained neutral, but I could see her exchanging glances with Lisa Chen. Lisa pressed harder. In your experience, what's the typical timeline for resolving environmental citations in a merger context? Are we looking at weeks, months, or could this delay the acquisition significantly? Richard was sweating now, subtle beads of perspiration appearing on his forehead despite the air conditioning. Timeline is always dependent on the specific circumstances. Some issues can be resolved quickly while others require more extensive remediation. Another non-answer. David Rodriguez tried a different approach. What's your experience with EPA Region 5 specifically? Our Ohio facility has some groundwater monitoring issues that Region 5 has flagged. How would you recommend we address those? This was the moment. Richard's eyes found mine across the conference room, a desperate plea for assistance. I'd handled dozens of EPA Region 5 cases, knew their enforcement priorities, their negotiation strategies, their preferred remediation approaches. I could have jumped in, provided the specific details that would satisfy Morrison's concerns, demonstrated the expertise that had built Richard's reputation. Instead, I remained silent, my expression neutral, my hands folded in my lap. I met Richard's gaze and offered the smallest possible nod. Not of assistance, but of acknowledgement. I saw him. I understood what he needed, and I was choosing not to provide it. Richard turned back to the Morrison team, his confidence visibly shaken. EPA Region 5 has its own specific requirements, of course. We'd need to conduct a detailed analysis of the groundwater situation before making specific recommendations. Patricia Morrison's patience was clearly wearing thin. Richard, I appreciate the need for thorough analysis, but we're looking for some indication that you understand the regulatory landscape we're operating in. Can you give us any specific insights about the challenges we might face? The silence stretched uncomfortably. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. Well, groundwater monitoring is always a complex issue. The EPA takes environmental protection very seriously, especially in industrial contexts. It was painful to watch. Richard was drowning in front of 3 experienced executives who'd expected to meet with a regulatory expert. Instead, they were listening to someone who clearly didn't understand the basics of environmental compliance law. Lisa Chen finally broke the silence. Perhaps we should reschedule this meeting. It might be helpful if you could bring your environmental specialist to the next discussion. Richard's face flushed red. I am the environmental specialist. I've been handling regulatory compliance for 20 years. I'm sure you have, Patricia Morrison said diplomatically, standing up from her chair. But I think we need to see a more detailed presentation of your capabilities before we proceed. David, Lisa, shall we head back to the office? As the Morrison team gathered their materials, Patricia Morrison turned to me. I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Patricia Morrison. Sarah Torres, I said, standing to shake her hand. I'm the regulatory compliance specialist here. Ah, she said, her eyes lighting up with recognition. I'd very much like to speak with you about this acquisition. Would you be available for a follow-up meeting? I glanced at Richard, whose face had gone pale. I'd be happy to discuss the regulatory aspects of your acquisition, Ms. Morrison. I've been working on your compliance analysis for the past 6 weeks. Patricia Morrison smiled. Excellent. Richard, perhaps Ms. Torres could take the lead on the technical presentation when we meet again? Richard nodded numbly, unable to speak. The Morrison team left the conference room, leaving us alone in the aftermath of his public humiliation. Sarah, Richard said quietly, his voice shaking. I need to talk to you. But I was already walking toward the door. I'll be in my office preparing for the follow-up meeting, Mr. Brennan, the one where I'll be presenting my analysis directly to the clients. For the first time in 4 years, I was no longer invisible. The confrontation I'd been preparing for 4 years finally arrived 3 hours after the Morrison Industries debacle. Richard had spent the afternoon behind his closed office door, making frantic phone calls and presumably trying to figure out how to salvage his reputation. Meanwhile, I'd been fielding calls from Patricia Morrison's office, scheduling a comprehensive presentation for the following week, where I would lead the technical discussion about Morrison's acquisition compliance requirements. At 6 p.m., when the office was mostly empty except for the cleaning staff, Richard finally emerged from his office and walked directly to mine. He didn't knock, just pushed open the door and stepped inside, his face a mixture of desperation and barely controlled anger. We need to talk, he said, closing the door behind him. About what happened today. I looked up from my computer where I'd been reviewing environmental compliance reports for the Morrison presentation. What about it? You could have helped me, he said, his voice tight with accusation. You sat there and watched me struggle when you knew exactly what those clients wanted to hear. You sabotaged me deliberately. I leaned back in my chair, studying his face. The confident, commanding presence he usually projected was completely gone, replaced by something rawer and more vulnerable. I sabotaged you by not doing your job for you? That's not what I meant, and you know it. We're a team, Sarah. When clients ask technical questions, you're supposed to support me, provide the expertise that makes this firm successful. Support you, I repeated slowly. The way I supported you during the Henderson manufacturing crisis? The way I supported you during the Patterson Industries review? The way I've been supporting you for 4 years while you take credit for my work? Richard's face flushed. I've never taken credit for your work. I've always acknowledged your contributions. I opened my laptop and turned the screen toward him. Would you like to see the Henderson manufacturing press release? The one where you're quoted as the innovative legal strategist who developed groundbreaking solutions for complex environmental compliance challenges? Or maybe the Patterson Industries testimonial letter, where they praise your deep understanding of FDA regulations and pharmaceutical compliance requirements? His eyes darted away from the screen. Those are marketing materials. They don't reflect the complexity of our internal collaboration. Internal collaboration, I said, my voice completely calm. Is that what you call it when you present my analysis as your own insights? When you use my research to answer questions you couldn't handle yourself? When you build your reputation on the foundation of my expertise, while simultaneously telling me I'm not partnership material? Richard ran his hand through his hair, his composure cracking further. Sarah, you don't understand the pressure I'm under. The partners are watching everything I do. If they think I'm losing my edge, if they realize I need help with technical matters, they'll push me out. I'm 62 years old. I can't start over. So you decided to build your security on my insecurity, I said. You decided that your career was more important than my dignity, my recognition, my future. It's not that simple, he said, his voice rising. You're young. You have time to build your own reputation. I'm at the end of my career. I need these last few years to secure my retirement, to take care of my mother, to. To what? I interrupted. To continue stealing credit for my work? To keep undermining my credibility while using my expertise to prop up your failing abilities? Richard's face went pale. How do you know about my mother? I know a lot of things, Richard. I know about your mother's illness, about your financial pressures, about your fear of being replaced by someone younger. I also know that none of that justifies what you've been doing to me. I opened another window on my laptop, showing him a folder labeled Documentation, Richard Brennan. I know about every inappropriate comment you've made about my disability. Every time you've excluded me from meetings where decisions about my career were made. Every instance where you've taken credit for my work while simultaneously questioning my professional competence. Richard stared at the screen, his face growing paler. You've been documenting our interactions? I've been documenting discrimination, Richard. Systematic, deliberate discrimination that violates federal law and company policy. I clicked open a subfolder labeled Audio Files, including our conversation 3 weeks ago where you told me that my prosthetic leg was distracting to clients and that I needed to consider whether I was really suited for client-facing work. You recorded me? His voice was barely above a whisper. I recorded workplace conversations where discriminatory statements were made, yes. It's perfectly legal in New York, and it's standard practice when building a discrimination case. I turned the laptop screen back toward me. Would you like to hear the recording from last month's performance review? The one where you suggested that my physical limitations might be affecting my judgment and recommended that I consider transitioning to a more suitable role in document review. Richard sank into the chair across from my desk, his head in his hands. Sarah, please. I never meant for any of this to happen. I was trying to protect you, to shield you from clients who might not understand. Stop, I said firmly. Don't you dare try to reframe discrimination as protection. You weren't shielding me from prejudiced clients. You were reinforcing their prejudices. You weren't protecting my career. You were systematically destroying it while building yours on the ruins. I opened another folder on my laptop. I have documentation of 43 instances over the past 4 years where you've either taken credit for my work or undermined my credibility. I have recordings of 12 separate conversations where you've made discriminatory comments about my disability. I have email threads where you've excluded me from opportunities while citing my limitations as justification. Richard looked up at me, his eyes wide with what looked like genuine fear. What do you want? What's this about? This is about justice, Richard. This is about consequences. This is about ensuring that you can never do to another person what you've done to me. I closed the laptop and leaned forward. Tomorrow morning, I'm filing a discrimination complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. I'm also filing a civil lawsuit against you personally and against Hartwell and Associates for systematic disability discrimination, hostile work environment, and wage theft. Wage theft? He sputtered. Taking credit for someone else's work while denying them appropriate compensation and advancement opportunities qualifies as wage theft under federal law. The Morrison Industries contract alone is worth $300,000 in fees. How much of that fee was based on work I performed? How much of the recognition and financial benefit should have been credited to my efforts? Richard's hands were shaking now. Sarah, please be reasonable. We can work this out. I can recommend you for promotion, increase your salary, give you the recognition you deserve. We don't need to involve lawyers or federal agencies. You're right, I said. We don't need to involve them. They're already involved. I picked up my phone and showed him the screen. I've been consulting with Jennifer Caldwell from Caldwell and Associates for the past 8 months. She's reviewed my documentation, analyzed the patterns of discrimination, and confirmed that I have one of the strongest disability discrimination cases she's ever seen. The name recognition hit him like a physical blow. Jennifer Caldwell? The civil rights attorney? The same Jennifer Caldwell who won the $12 million settlement against Morrison and Associates last year for disability discrimination. The same Jennifer Caldwell, who's never lost a case involving systematic workplace discrimination. I set the phone down. She's very interested in this case, Richard. She says the documentation is so comprehensive that it's practically a textbook example of how discrimination operates in corporate environments. Richard was quiet for a long moment, the weight of the situation settling over him. How long have you been planning this? I've been documenting discrimination for 4 years. I've been building a legal case for 8 months. But I've been planning to take control of my own career for much longer than that. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. You know what the irony is, Richard. You were so busy trying to erase me that you never realized you were making yourself completely dependent on me. Without my expertise, without my work, without my analysis, you're just an expensive suit with a corner office. I turned back to face him. Tomorrow, Patricia Morrison is going to discover that the brilliant regulatory strategist she thought she was hiring is actually a disabled veteran who's been working in the shadows while you took credit for her expertise. She's going to learn that every innovative solution, every complex analysis, every strategic insight came from someone you've been systematically discriminating against for 4 years. Richard's face was ashen. They'll destroy me? The partners, the clients, the industry? My reputation will be ruined. Your reputation was built on stolen work and discriminatory practices? I said simply. Maybe it's time for it to be built on something real. The next morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that follows a storm. I was in my office by 6 a.m., not because I needed to prepare for the Morrison Industries presentation, but because I wanted to be there when Richard's world began to collapse. Jennifer Caldwell had filed the EEOC complaint at 8 a.m. sharp, exactly as we'd planned. The federal lawsuit would follow within hours, but first, I wanted to watch Richard try to maintain his facade during the most important client presentation of his career. The Morrison Industries team arrived at 9 a.m., but this time they brought reinforcements. Patricia Morrison was accompanied by Lisa Chen, David Rodriguez, and 2 additional executives I didn't recognize. They clearly meant business. And after Richard's disastrous performance during the initial meeting, they weren't taking any chances. Richard greeted them in the lobby, his usual confident smile firmly in place, but I could see the strain around his eyes. He'd spent the night trying to prepare for technical questions he couldn't answer, reviewing compliance materials he didn't understand, desperately trying to memorize enough details to appear competent. It was like watching an actor rehearse for a role he'd never properly studied. Patricia, Lisa, David, welcome back to Hartwell and Associates, Richard said, his voice carrying its familiar boom. I'm excited to present our comprehensive analysis of the Morrison Industries acquisition compliance requirements. Patricia Morrison's smile was polite but measured. Thank you, Richard. We're looking forward to seeing the technical details we discussed. Will Ms. Torres be joining us for this presentation? Of course, Richard replied, but there was something brittle in his voice. Sarah will be providing supporting documentation for the analysis I've prepared. Supporting documentation. Even now facing the most important presentation of his career, Richard couldn't bring himself to acknowledge my expertise. He was still trying to position me as his assistant rather than the architect of the entire compliance strategy. We moved into the main conference room, the same space where Richard had humiliated me in front of the Morrison team just days before. But this time, the dynamic was different. Patricia Morrison specifically requested that I sit at the main table, while Richard took his position at the presentation podium. Before we begin, Patricia said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd built a $200 million company from nothing, I want to clarify something. During our last meeting, it became clear that there was some confusion about expertise and responsibilities. Today, we need to hear from whoever actually developed the compliance analysis we're paying for. The comment hung in the air like a challenge. Richard's face flushed slightly, but he maintained his composure. I assure you, Patricia, that I've personally overseen every aspect of this analysis. Sarah has been instrumental in gathering data, but the strategic insights and recommendations come from my 20 years of experience in regulatory compliance. Lisa Chen, the general counsel, leaned forward. That's exactly what we need to understand. Can you walk us through the specific EPA region 5 requirements that will affect our Ohio facility? You mentioned conducting a detailed analysis, so we'd like to see those details. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Richard turned to his presentation materials, clicking through slides that displayed charts and graphs I'd created, regulatory frameworks I'd analyzed, and compliance timelines I'd developed. But when he opened his mouth to explain the content, it was clear he was reading from a script rather than demonstrating understanding. The EPA region. 5 requirements for manufacturing facilities focus on groundwater monitoring protocols, air quality standards, and waste disposal compliance. Richard began, his voice gaining confidence as he recited the information I'd provided. Our analysis indicates that Morrison's Ohio facility has 3 minor citations that need to be addressed before the acquisition can proceed. David Rodriguez raised his hand. Can you specify which citations pose the greatest risk to our timeline? Are we looking at administrative penalties, operational restrictions, or potential criminal liability? Richard paused, his eyes darting to his notes. Well, the citations involve environmental monitoring requirements that need to be updated to current standards. Which monitoring requirements? Lisa Chen pressed. Are we talking about groundwater sampling frequency, emission monitoring protocols, or waste tracking procedures? Another pause. Richard was clearly struggling, trying to find the right words to explain concepts he didn't fully understand. The monitoring requirements are comprehensive, covering multiple aspects of environmental compliance. Patricia Morrison's expression was growing colder by the minute. Richard, I'm not hearing specific answers to specific questions. Can you tell us exactly what steps need to be taken to resolve these citations? That's when I decided to end Richard's suffering. Ms. Morrison, if I may address your concerns directly, I said, standing from my chair. The 3 citations at your Ohio facility involve quarterly groundwater sampling protocols that were updated by EPA Region 5 in 2023. Your facility has been using the previous sampling methodology, which doesn't meet current contamination detection standards. Patricia Morrison's attention shifted to me completely. Go on. The first citation requires implementing enhanced sampling protocols at 12 monitoring wells, with specific attention to volatile organic compounds and heavy metals. The estimated cost is $15,000 per quarter, and implementation can be completed within 60 days. The second citation involves air quality monitoring for particulate matter emissions, which requires upgrading 2 monitoring stations at a cost of approximately $75,000 with a 90-day implementation timeline. I pulled up a detailed chart on my laptop and connected it to the conference room display. The third citation is the most complex, involving waste tracking procedures that don't meet current EPA data management requirements. This requires updating your waste manifest system and training 12 employees on new protocols. Implementation cost is approximately $25,000 with a 45-day timeline. Lisa Chen was taking notes rapidly. What about the criminal liability risk? Minimal, I replied immediately. These are administrative violations, not willful noncompliance. EPA Region 5's enforcement priorities focus on facilities with intentional violations or environmental damage. Morrison's citations are procedural, not substantive. With proper remediation, there's no criminal exposure. David Rodriguez leaned forward. How do you know EPA Region 5's enforcement priorities? Because I've handled 37 cases involving EPA Region 5 over the past 4 years, guys, I said. I know their regional administrator, their enforcement staff, and their preferred remediation approaches. I also know that they're currently focused on facilities in the chemical processing sector, not manufacturing companies like Morrison. Patricia Morrison was staring at me with the focused intensity of someone who just discovered something valuable. Ms. Torres, you seem to have a much deeper understanding of our situation than we realized. Have you personally reviewed our facilities? I've conducted site visits at all 3 of your manufacturing locations, reviewed 5 years of compliance records, and analyzed your environmental management systems against current federal and state requirement, I replied. I've also prepared detailed remediation plans for each citation, including cost estimates, implementation timelines, and ongoing compliance strategies. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard was standing at the podium, his presentation materials forgotten, his face pale as he watched 4 years of stolen credit dissolve in real time. The Morrison executives were staring at me with expressions of recognition and growing anger. "Mr. Brennan," Patricia Morrison said, her voice dangerously quiet, "are you telling us that Ms. Torres conducted the actual analysis while you took credit for her work?" Before Richard could answer, my phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer Caldwell. EEOC complaint filed. Press conference scheduled for 2 p.m. Federal lawsuit being filed now. I looked at Richard, then at the Morrison executives, then back at Richard. "Actually, Ms. Morrison, that's exactly what happened. And it's about to become a matter of public record." I opened my laptop and turned the screen toward the table. At 8 a.m. this morning, I filed a federal discrimination complaint against Richard Brennan and Hartwell and Associates. The complaint includes 4 years of documented evidence showing systematic disability discrimination, wage theft, and hostile work environment violations. Patricia Morrison's eyes widened. "You're filing a lawsuit?" "I'm filing a lawsuit that will expose exactly how regulatory compliance expertise is actually developed at this firm," I replied. "And I think you'll find the evidence very illuminating regarding who's actually qualified to handle your acquisition compliance requirements." Richard finally found his voice. "Sarah, please, not in front of the clients." "Not in front of the clients?" I interrupted. "You mean the clients who deserve to know that the expert they thought they were hiring was actually taking credit for a disabled veteran's work? The clients who had a right to know that their trusted advisor was systematically discriminating against his most qualified employee?" I turned back to Patricia Morrison. "Ms. Morrison, would you like to see the actual analysis of your acquisition compliance requirements? The one I prepared without any assistance from Mr. Brennan?" The answer was written across her face before she spoke. "Yes, Ms. Torres. I think that would be very educational." As I opened the comprehensive compliance analysis I'd prepared, I could see Richard's reflection in the conference room window. He was no longer standing at the podium. He was slumped in a chair, his 20-year career crumbling around him. The 7 minutes that would end his career had just begun. The next morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that follows a storm. I was in my office by 6 a.m., not because I needed to prepare for the Morrison Industries presentation, but because I wanted to be there when Richard's world began to collapse. Jennifer Caldwell had filed the EEOC complaint at 8 a.m. sharp, exactly as we'd planned. The federal lawsuit would follow within hours, but first I wanted to watch Richard try to maintain his facade during the most important client presentation of his career. The Morrison Industries team arrived at 9 a.m., but this time they brought reinforcements. Patricia Morrison was accompanied by Lisa Chen, David Rodriguez, and 2 additional executives I didn't recognize: their head of legal affairs, Michael Park, and their chief operating officer, Sandra Williams. They clearly meant business, and after Richard's disastrous performance during the initial meeting, they weren't taking any chances with their $180 million acquisition. Richard greeted them in the lobby, his usual confident smile firmly in place, but I could see the strain around his eyes. Dark circles suggested he'd spent the night trying to prepare for technical questions he couldn't answer, reviewing compliance materials he didn't understand, desperately trying to memorize enough details to appear competent. It was like watching an actor rehearse for a role he'd never properly studied, cramming lines he didn't comprehend. "Patricia, Lisa, David, welcome back to Hartwell and Associates," Richard said, his voice carrying its familiar boom, though there was something hollow about it now. "I'm excited to present our comprehensive analysis of the Morrison Industries acquisition compliance requirements." Patricia Morrison's smile was polite but measured, the expression of someone who'd built a $200 million company by making hard decisions based on facts rather than feelings. "Thank you, Richard. We're looking forward to seeing the technical details we discussed. Will Ms. Torres be joining us for this presentation?" "Of course," Richard replied, but there was something brittle in his voice, like ice beginning to crack under pressure. "Sarah will be providing supporting documentation for the analysis I've prepared." Supporting documentation. Even now facing the most important presentation of his career, Richard couldn't bring himself to acknowledge my expertise. He was still trying to position me as his assistant rather than the architect of the entire compliance strategy, still clinging to the narrative that had defined our relationship for 4 years. We moved into the main conference room, the same space where Richard had humiliated me in front of the Morrison team just days before. But this time, the dynamic was different. Patricia Morrison specifically requested that I sit at the main table directly across from her while Richard took his position at the presentation podium. The seating arrangement itself was telling. She wanted to be able to see my reactions, to gauge my responses to whatever Richard was about to present. Before we begin, Patricia said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd built her company from nothing and had no patience for corporate games, I want to clarify something. During our last meeting, it became clear that there was some confusion about expertise and responsibilities. Today, we need to hear from whoever actually developed the compliance analysis we're paying for. The comment hung in the air like a challenge, direct and unambiguous. Richard's face flushed slightly, but he maintained his composure with the practiced skill of someone who'd spent decades in corporate boardrooms. I assure you, Patricia, that I've personally overseen every aspect of this analysis. Sarah has been instrumental in gathering data, but the strategic insights and recommendations come from my 20 years of experience in regulatory compliance. Lisa Chen, the general counsel, leaned forward with the focused intensity of someone who'd spent years cross-examining witnesses. That's exactly what we need to understand. Can you walk us through the specific EPA Region 5 requirements that will affect our Ohio facility? You mentioned conducting a detailed analysis, so we'd like to see those details. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The moment when Richard would have to demonstrate actual expertise rather than borrowed confidence. Richard turned to his presentation materials, clicking through slides that displayed charts and graphs I'd created, regulatory frameworks I'd analyzed, and compliance timelines I'd developed. But when he opened his mouth to explain the content, it was immediately clear he was reading from a script rather than demonstrating understanding. The EPA Region 5 requirements for manufacturing facilities focus on groundwater monitoring protocols, air quality standards, and waste disposal compliance, Richard began, his voice gaining false confidence as he recited the information I'd provided in my briefing materials. Our analysis indicates that Morrison's Ohio facility has 3 minor citations that need to be addressed before the acquisition can proceed. David Rodriguez raised his hand, his expression skeptical. Can you specify which citations pose the greatest risk to our timeline? Are we looking at administrative penalties, operational restrictions, or potential criminal liability? Richard paused, his eyes darting to his notes like a student who'd forgotten the answer to a question he'd studied. Well, the citations involve environmental monitoring requirements that need to be updated to current standards. Which monitoring requirements? Lisa Chen pressed, her tone sharpening with each evasive answer. Are we talking about groundwater sampling frequency, emission monitoring protocols, or waste tracking procedures? Another pause, longer this time. Richard was clearly struggling, trying to find the right words to explain concepts he didn't fully understand. His usual confident demeanor was cracking, revealing the uncertainty beneath. The monitoring requirements are comprehensive, covering multiple aspects of environmental compliance. Michael Park, the head of legal affairs, leaned back in his chair with the expression of someone who'd just realized they might be dealing with a fraud. Mr. Brennan, we're not looking for generalities. We need specific guidance on specific issues. Can you tell us exactly what steps need to be taken to resolve these citations? Sandra Williams, the COO, added her own pressure. Our board is meeting next week to approve this acquisition. We need concrete answers about compliance risks, implementation timelines, and financial implications. Can you provide those details? Richard was visibly sweating now, despite the air conditioning. He shuffled through his notes, trying to find answers to questions that required deep technical knowledge, not memorized talking points. The compliance requirements are complex, involving multiple regulatory frameworks that need to be carefully coordinated. Patricia Morrison's expression was growing colder by the minute. Richard, I'm not hearing specific answers to specific questions. Can you tell us exactly what steps need to be taken to resolve these citations? That's when I decided to end Richard's suffering and reveal the truth that had been hidden for 4 years. Ms. Morrison, if I may address your concerns directly, and I said, standing from my chair with the confidence of someone who'd spent weeks preparing for this exact moment. The three citations at your Ohio facility involve quarterly groundwater sampling protocols that were updated by EPA Region 5 in 2023. Your facility has been using the previous sampling methodology, which doesn't meet current contamination detection standards. Patricia Morrison's attention shifted to me completely, her entire focus zeroing in on someone who was finally providing the specificity she'd been demanding. Go on. The first citation requires implementing enhanced sampling protocols at 12 monitoring wells with specific attention to volatile organic compounds and heavy metals. The estimated cost is $15,000 per quarter, and implementation can be completed within 60 days of regulatory approval. The second citation involves air quality monitoring for particulate matter emissions, which requires upgrading two monitoring stations at a cost of approximately $75,000 with a 90-day implementation timeline that can run concurrent with the sampling protocol updates. I pulled up a detailed chart on my laptop and connected it to the conference room display, showing comprehensive timelines, cost breakdowns, and regulatory approval processes. The third citation is the most complex, involving waste tracking procedures that don't meet current EPA data management requirements. This requires updating your waste manifest system and training 12 employees on new protocols. Implementation cost is approximately $25,000 with a 45-day timeline that can be coordinated with the other remediation efforts. Lisa Chen was taking notes rapidly, her pen moving across the page as she captured details that had been completely absent from Richard's presentation. What about the criminal liability risk? Minimal, I replied immediately, with the confidence of someone who'd analyzed hundreds of similar cases. These are administrative violations, not willful non-compliance. EPA Region 5's enforcement priorities focus on facilities with intentional violations or environmental damage. Morrison's citations are procedural, not substantive. With proper remediation, there's no criminal exposure. David Rodriguez leaned forward, his skepticism now focused on Richard rather than me. How do you know EPA Region 5's enforcement priorities? Because I've handled 37 cases involving EPA Region 5 over the past 4 years, I said, my voice steady and professional. I know their regional administrator, their enforcement staff, and their preferred remediation approaches. I also know that they're currently focused on facilities in the chemical processing sector, not manufacturing companies like Morrison. Your company profile doesn't match their current enforcement priorities. Michael Park was staring at me with the expression of someone who just discovered a valuable asset. Ms. Torres, you seem to have a much deeper understanding of our situation than we realized. Have you personally reviewed our facilities? I've conducted site visits at all 3 of your manufacturing locations, reviewed 5 years of compliance records, and analyzed your environmental management systems against current federal and state requirements, I replied. I've also prepared detailed remediation plans for each citation, including cost estimates, implementation timelines, and ongoing compliance strategies that will keep you ahead of regulatory changes. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard was standing at the podium, his presentation materials forgotten, his face pale as he watched 4 years of stolen credit dissolve in real time. The Morrison executives were staring at me with expressions of recognition and growing anger, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. Mr. Brennan, Patricia Morrison said, her voice dangerously quiet with the controlled fury of someone who'd just realized they'd been deceived. Are you telling us that Ms. Torres conducted the actual analysis while you took credit for her work? Before Richard could answer, my phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer Caldwell, EEOC complaint filed. Press conference scheduled for 2 p.m. Federal lawsuit being filed now. Are you ready? I looked at Richard, then at the Morrison executives, then back at Richard. His face had gone completely white, and I could see the exact moment when he realized that his career was about to be destroyed by the very person he'd been systematically undermining. Actually, Ms. Morrison, that's exactly what happened, I said, my voice carrying across the conference room with absolute clarity. And it's about to become a matter of public record. I opened my laptop and turned the screen toward the table, displaying the federal lawsuit that was being filed at that exact moment. At 8 a.m. this morning, I filed a federal discrimination complaint against Richard Brennan and Hartwell and Associates. The complaint includes 4 years of documented evidence showing systematic disability discrimination, wage theft, and hostile work environment violations. Patricia Morrison's eyes widened, her business instincts immediately recognizing the implications. You're filing a lawsuit? I'm filing a lawsuit that will expose exactly how regulatory compliance expertise is actually developed at this firm, I replied. And I think you'll find the evidence very illuminating regarding who's actually qualified to handle your acquisition compliance requirements. Richard finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Sarah, please, not in front of the clients. Not in front of the clients? I interrupted, my voice rising with 4 years of suppressed anger. You mean the clients who deserve to know that the expert they thought they were hiring was actually taking credit for a disabled veteran's work? The clients who had a right to know that their trusted advisor was systematically discriminating against his most qualified employee? I turned back to Patricia Morrison, my laptop screen showing the comprehensive case file that Jennifer Caldwell had prepared. Ms. Morrison, would you like to see the actual analysis of your acquisition compliance requirements? The one I prepared without any assistance from Mr. Brennan? The answer was written across her face before she spoke, a mixture of professional curiosity and personal outrage. Yes, Ms. Torres. I think that would be very educational. As I opened the comprehensive compliance analysis I'd prepared, showing detailed regulatory frameworks, implementation strategies, and cost-benefit analyses that demonstrated months of expert work, I could see Richard's reflection in the conference room window. He was no longer standing at the podium. He was slumped in a chair, his 20-year career crumbling around him in real time. The 7 minutes that would end his career had just begun. The 7 minutes that destroyed Richard Brennan's career began with Patricia Morrison's voice cutting through the conference room like a blade. Ms. Torres, I want you to walk us through every aspect of your analysis, and I want Mr. Brennan to remain silent unless specifically asked to contribute. It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered with the authority of someone who'd just realized they'd been systematically deceived. Richard opened his mouth to object, but Patricia's raised hand stopped him cold. You've had your chance to demonstrate expertise, Mr. Brennan. Now I want to hear from the person who actually did the work. I pulled up my comprehensive Morrison Industries compliance analysis, 4 months of detailed research that I'd conducted entirely independently. The presentation filled the conference room's main display, showing regulatory frameworks, implementation timelines, and cost-benefit analyses that demonstrated not just technical knowledge, but strategic thinking at the highest level. Morrison Industries faces compliance challenges across 3 regulatory jurisdictions, I began, my voice steady and professional. But these challenges also represent competitive advantages if properly managed. Your Ohio facility's groundwater monitoring citations, for example, can be resolved with enhanced protocols that will actually reduce your long-term environmental liability costs. I clicked to a detailed chart showing cost projections over 5 years. The initial investment of $115,000 for all 3 facilities will save Morrison approximately $340,000 in potential penalties and insurance premiums over the next 3 years. More importantly, it positions you ahead of regulatory changes that your competitors haven't anticipated. Sandra Williams, the COO, leaned forward with the focused attention of someone who understood operational excellence. What regulatory changes are you referring to? EPA Region 5 is developing new manufacturing facility standards that will take effect in 2026, I explained, opening a separate analysis I'd prepared. Companies that implement enhanced monitoring protocols now will be grandfathered under more favorable compliance terms. Your competitors who wait until the regulations are finalized will face significantly higher implementation costs and stricter oversight requirements. Michael Park, the head of legal affairs, was taking detailed notes. How do you know about regulations that haven't been published yet? Because I maintain relationships with regulatory officials across multiple EPA regions, I replied. I attend industry conferences, participate in regulatory comment periods, and monitor federal rulemaking processes. Understanding regulatory trends is essential for developing proactive compliance strategies. Lisa Chen looked up from her notes, Can you give us specific examples of how this forward thinking approach has benefited other clients? I opened another case study, one that Richard had never seen because it was based on my independent research. Last year, I helped Patterson Industries implement enhanced pharmaceutical manufacturing protocols 6 months before FDA requirements changed. When the new regulations took effect, Patterson was already compliant, while their competitors spent millions on emergency upgrades. Patterson's stock price increased 12% in the quarter following the regulatory change. David Rodriguez was staring at the presentation with the expression of someone who'd just discovered a hidden treasure. Ms. Torres, this level of strategic analysis is exactly what we need. Can you tell us about your background in regulatory compliance? I have a law degree with a concentration in administrative law, 4 years of experience in corporate compliance, and 8 years of military intelligence experience analyzing complex regulatory environments, I said. My military background taught me to think systematically about risk assessment and strategic planning. My legal training gave me the technical expertise to navigate federal and state regulatory frameworks. Patricia Morrison's expression had shifted from anger to something approaching admiration. Your military experience? Is that relevant to corporate compliance work? Military intelligence and corporate compliance require identical skill sets, I explained. You analyze complex, constantly changing environments. You identify potential threats before they materialize. You develop strategic responses that protect your assets while advancing your mission. The only difference is the uniform. That's when Richard finally found his voice, though it came out strangled with desperation. Sarah, I think you're overstating your role in these matters. This is clearly a collaborative effort between Mr. Brennan. Patricia Morrison interrupted, her voice carrying the kind of authority that could silence a boardroom. I asked you to remain quiet unless specifically questioned. Ms. Torres, please continue. I clicked to the next section of my presentation, showing detailed facility assessments I'd conducted independently. I visited each Morrison facility multiple times, conducted interviews with your plant managers, and reviewed your operational procedures. Your Texas facility has an opportunity to implement innovative waste reduction protocols that could qualify for federal tax incentives worth approximately $180,000 annually. Sandra Williams was practically leaning across the table. What kind of tax incentives? The EPA's Green Manufacturing Initiative offers substantial tax credits for companies that exceed baseline environmental standard, I explained. Your Texas facility's production processes already come close to qualifying. With minor modifications costing approximately $50,000, you could capture tax benefits that would pay for the entire Morrison Acquisition Compliance Program. Michael Park looked up from his notes with the expression of someone who'd just realized they were dealing with expertise at a completely different level. Ms. Torres, have you shared this tax incentive analysis with anyone else at Hartwell and Associates? No, I replied simply. I developed this analysis independently as part of my comprehensive review of Morrison's acquisition potential. Lisa Chen was staring at Richard with barely concealed disgust. Mr. Brennan, were you aware that your employee had identified nearly $200,000 in annual tax savings for our company? Richard's face had gone completely pale. That is, Sarah handles many technical details that contribute to our overall strategic approach. Technical details, Patricia Morrison repeated, her voice dripping with contempt. You're calling strategic analysis worth hundreds of thousands of dollars technical details. That's when my phone rang. Jennifer Caldwell's name appeared on the screen, and I knew this was the call I'd been waiting for. Excuse me for just a moment, I said, answering the phone. Jennifer, how did the filing go? Sarah, it's done. Jennifer's voice was clear enough for everyone in the room to hear. The federal lawsuit has been filed, and the press conference is scheduled for 2 p.m. But I'm getting calls from reporters already. The story is going to break within the hour. I looked around the conference room at the Morrison executives, all of whom were staring at me with expressions of shock and growing understanding. Jennifer, I'm currently in a client meeting where the discrimination I've been documenting is being exposed in real time. Would you like me to put you on speaker? Actually, yes, Jennifer replied. I'd like to address the Morrison Industries executives directly, if that's possible. I activated the speakerphone and set it in the center of the conference table. Jennifer Caldwell, this is Patricia Morrison, CEO of Morrison Industries, along with my executive team. What exactly is happening here? Ms. Morrison, my name is Jennifer Caldwell, and I'm a civil rights attorney representing Sarah Torres in a federal discrimination lawsuit against Hartwell and Associates and Richard Brennan personally. Jennifer's voice filled the room with professional authority. The lawsuit alleges systematic disability discrimination, wage theft, and hostile work environment violations spanning 4 years. Patricia Morrison's expression had shifted to something approaching fury. Wage theft? Can you be more specific? Ms. Torres has documented 43 instances where her work product was presented as Mr. Brennan's expertise, while she was denied appropriate compensation, recognition, and advancement opportunities, Jennifer explained. Under federal law, this constitutes wage theft when an employer systematically takes credit for an employee's work while denying them fair compensation. David Rodriguez was staring at Richard with the expression of someone who'd just witnessed a crime. Mr. Brennan, is this true? Before Richard could answer, Jennifer continued. The lawsuit includes audio recordings, email documentation, and witness testimony proving systematic discrimination. We also have evidence that Mr. Brennan made explicitly discriminatory comments about Ms. Torres's prosthetic leg, including statements that her disability made clients uncomfortable and that she should consider whether she was suited for client-facing work. Sandra Williams turned to Richard, her voice sharp with anger. You said that to her? About her military service injuries? Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. There may have been misunderstandings about my intent. Mr. Brennan, Jennifer's voice cut through his stammering. Do you deny making those statements? That is, conversations can be taken out of context. We have recordings, Jennifer said simply. Clear, unambiguous recordings of discriminatory statements. Would you like me to play them for Ms. Morrison's team? Patricia Morrison was staring at Richard with the kind of controlled fury that preceded corporate executions. Yes, Ms. Caldwell, I think that would be very educational. Jennifer's voice came through the speakerphone with crystal clarity. This is a recording from March 15th, during a performance review meeting between Mr. Brennan and Ms. Torres. Richard's voice filled the conference room, tinny but unmistakable. Sarah, I need you to understand that your physical limitations are affecting your professional presentation. Clients notice when you need to adjust your prosthetic during meetings. It's distracting, and frankly, it raises questions about your fitness for client-facing work. Then my voice, steady and professional. Mr. Brennan, are you suggesting that my prosthetic leg affects my ability to perform my job duties? Richard's recorded voice again. I'm suggesting that perception matters as much as performance in this business. Your disability creates discomfort for clients, and that's something we need to address. The silence that followed was deafening. Every executive around the table was staring at Richard with expressions of revulsion and disbelief. Patricia Morrison's face had gone completely cold, the expression of someone who just witnessed something unforgivable. Mr. Brennan, Patricia Morrison said, her voice deadly quiet. You just admitted to discriminating against a disabled veteran. In front of witnesses. On a recorded call. Richard's career didn't just end in that moment. It disintegrated completely. 4 years of stolen credit and systematic discrimination, collapsing in less than 7 minutes of truth. The revolution had begun, and there was no going back. The silence that followed the recording was broken by Patricia Morrison's voice, colder than winter steel. Mr. Brennan, this meeting is over. Ms. Torres, we need to discuss transferring our account to your direct management immediately. Richard's face had gone from pale to gray, the color of someone watching their entire world collapse in real time. Patricia, please, let me explain. Explain what? Patricia Morrison stood from her chair, her voice rising with righteous fury. Explain how you've been stealing credit from a disabled veteran? Explain how you've been discriminating against the most qualified person in your firm? Explain how you've been charging us premium rates for expertise you don't actually possess? Lisa Chen was already packing her briefcase, her movements sharp with professional disgust. Ms. Torres, Morrison Industries would like to retain your services directly. We're terminating our contract with Hartwell and Associates effective immediately. David Rodriguez added his voice to the chorus of condemnation. Mr. Brennan, we'll be recommending that our industry contacts avoid doing business with your firm. What you've done here is unconscionable. Sandra Williams was staring at Richard with the expression of someone who'd just witnessed a moral crime. You took credit for her work while simultaneously telling her she wasn't good enough for client-facing roles? That's not just discrimination, that's sadistic. Michael Park was taking notes rapidly, his legal mind already working through the implications. Ms. Torres, Morrison Industries will be happy to provide testimony supporting your discrimination case. What we've witnessed here today needs to be documented. Jennifer Caldwell's voice came through the speakerphone with satisfaction. Ms. Morrison, I appreciate your support. This case is about more than just Sarah's individual situation. It's about systemic discrimination against disabled workers, especially veterans who've sacrificed for their country. Richard finally found his voice, though it came out as desperate pleading. Sarah, please, we can work this out. I'll recommend you for partnership, increase your salary, give you full credit for your work going forward. We don't need to destroy everything we've built together. I looked at him across the conference table. This man who'd spent 4 years systematically undermining me while building his reputation on my expertise. Richard, you didn't build anything with me. You built your career on top of me, using my work as a foundation while trying to bury me beneath it. I turned to Patricia Morrison, my voice clear and confident. Ms. Morrison, I accept your offer to handle Morrison Industries' compliance requirements directly. I'll be establishing my own consulting practice specializing in regulatory compliance for manufacturing companies. Patricia Morrison smiled, the first genuine warmth I'd seen from her during either meeting. Ms. Torres, we'd be honored to be your first client, and we'll be recommending your services to every company in our industry network. That's when the conference room door opened, and 3 people entered who made Richard's face go completely white. The first was Marcus Webb, the managing partner of Hartwell and Associates. The second was Helen Rodriguez, the firm's head of human resources. The third was a woman I didn't recognize, but her professional demeanor and legal briefcase suggested she was the firm's attorney. Richard, Marcus Webb said, his voice carrying the weight of someone delivering a death sentence. We need to speak with you immediately. The EEOC complaint has been forwarded to our office, and we've received calls from 3 reporters asking for comment on the federal lawsuit. Helen Rodriguez was holding a thick folder that I recognized as my personnel file. Mr. Brennan, we've reviewed Ms. Torres' documentation, and the evidence of systematic discrimination is overwhelming. You're being terminated immediately, effective now. The unknown attorney spoke for the first time. Mr. Brennan, I'm Janet Foster, and I'll be representing Hartwell and Associates in this matter. I need to inform you that the firm will not be providing legal representation for you personally. You're on your own. Richard's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, the full weight of his situation finally hitting him. Not only had he lost his job, but he was facing a federal lawsuit without institutional support, public humiliation, and the complete destruction of his professional reputation. Marcus Webb turned to me, his expression mixing apology with desperate hope. Ms. Torres, on behalf of Hartwell and Associates, I want to apologize for what you've endured. We'd like to offer you Richard's position as senior partner, with full equity participation and a starting salary of $300,000. I looked around the room at the Morrison executives who were watching this corporate drama unfold with fascination. Then I looked at Richard, who was staring at me with the expression of someone who just realized that his victim had become his executioner. Mr. Webb, I appreciate the offer, but I've already accepted a position with Morrison Industries as their director of regulatory compliance, I said. I'll be building my own practice, working with companies that value expertise over politics. Patricia Morrison stood up, extending her hand to me. Ms. Torres, welcome to the Morrison Industries family. Your starting salary will be $350,000, plus equity participation and full benefits. You'll also have complete autonomy to build your compliance division. As I shook her hand, I looked back at Richard one final time. He was slumped in his chair, his 20-year career destroyed, his reputation in ruins, his future uncertain. The man who'd spent 4 years telling me I wasn't good enough for client-facing work was now watching me walk away with his biggest client and a salary that exceeded his own. Jennifer Caldwell's voice came through the speakerphone one final time. Sarah, the press conference is in 30 minutes. Are you ready to tell your story to the world? I'm ready, I replied, my voice steady and confident. It's time for other disabled workers to know that discrimination has consequences. 6 months later, I was sitting in my corner office on the 32nd floor of Morrison Industries headquarters, looking out at the city skyline. My regulatory compliance division had grown to 12 employees, all of them chosen for their expertise rather than their ability to play corporate politics. We'd landed 6 major clients, saved our companies over $3 million in regulatory penalties, and earned a reputation as the most innovative compliance firm in the industry. The federal lawsuit had been settled for $2.3 million, with additional punitive damages that sent a clear message about the cost of discrimination. Richard Brennan had been forced to declare bankruptcy, his legal career effectively over. Hartwell and Associates had implemented comprehensive anti-discrimination policies and mandatory training programs. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was walking into client meetings where I was introduced as our brilliant compliance expert, rather than our dedicated specialist. It was building a team where disabled workers were valued for their unique perspectives rather than seen as liabilities. It was proving that excellence has nothing to do with ability status and everything to do with determination, expertise, and integrity. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Jennifer Caldwell calling with news about our latest case. Sarah, I just got off the phone with 3 more disabled veterans who want to file discrimination lawsuits against their employers, Yari, she said. They all said your story gave them the courage to fight back. I smiled, looking out at the city where countless other workers were facing their own battles against discrimination. Jennifer, let's make sure they know they're not fighting alone. The revolution that began with one woman's refusal to accept discrimination had become a movement, and it was just the beginning. That's how a 7-minute confrontation ended a career built on stolen credit and systematic discrimination. It's how a disabled veteran transformed from an invisible employee to a recognized leader in her field. And it's how speaking truth to power, no matter how frightening, can change not just your own life, but the lives of everyone who comes after you. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you that justice is possible even when the odds seem impossible, please subscribe to this channel. Share your own stories of overcoming discrimination and fighting for what's right. Because every voice matters, every story has power, and every person deserves to be seen for their true worth rather than their perceived limitations. Thank you for listening, and remember, you are stronger than you know, more capable than they believe, and more valuable than they'll ever admit. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise.